Hello and welcome to episode number 19 of the Joe Cannon Health Podcast. I'm Joe Cannon. The main topic for this week's discussion is whether or not metformin is an anti-aging drug. So the world of anti-aging is something that has been a topic I've been interested in for over 40 years. And if you go to my Supplement Clarity website, you'll notice that I devote a lot of attention to anti-aging dietary supplements. I like to try to save people time and money as they decide which supplements are right for them. And I've noticed that a lot of supplements make the claim that they can slow down or maybe even reverse the aging process. And I like to talk about that a lot because as we all grow older, this is something that we're interested in. But metformin is not a dietary supplement. It's actually a prescription medication. And in the world of anti-aging medicine, metformin is quite popular. And so I want to talk this week about the research on metformin as it pertains to helping us live longer and try to put that in proper context. Now, before we go any further and talk about that, I want to cover the myth of the week. This is actually a continuation of the myth I addressed last week, where I talked about what weighs more, muscle and fat. So that was in episode 18. Today, however, let's talk about whether your muscle turns into fat after you stop working out. The fact of the matter is, really, it doesn't. Muscle does not turn into fat. And it makes sense when you think of it this way. Muscle and fat are basically two different tissues. Muscle's made of muscle and fat is made of, well, fat. So they really are not the same thing. It's kind of like trying to turn wood into gold. You just can't do it. It doesn't happen. So why do people often look like they've gained fat after they say stop working out? Again, it's not because their muscle turned into fat. What the heck is happening here? Well, I think the most logical reason is that when people stop working out, they continue to eat as if they're still working out. They continue to eat the same amount of calories. We sometimes see this, for example, in former professional athletes. After they retire, after a few years, they looked as if they've gained a lot of weight. Again, they're no longer working out several hours a day, but yet they're still eating as if they were. So while it may look like their muscle turned into fat, what really happened is that their muscles atrophied because they were not working out to the same degree they were before, but they continued to eat the same amount of calories as they were when they're working out. Without that extra exercise to burn off all those extra calories, the weight increased. And so it looked like their muscle turned into fat, but in reality, they just gained extra weight. So myth busted. Muscle does not turn into fat. Now, before we go any further, I want to thank Taco Sauce for his 5-star review in Apple Podcasts. Taco basically says this: Joe does a great job at distilling information about complex topics and body systems without losing the technical appreciation. He makes it very easy and understandable. Great resource. Taco, I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to write those words. And your words are actually really appropriate because this week's topic is pretty darn technical. I want to again talk about whether or not the drug metformin is an anti-aging medication. In other words, can it help us live longer? So whether you're aware of this or not, this is actually a pretty hot topic in some circles. As I was preparing for this episode, I even read reports that Silicon Valley big shots were taking metformin as a way to perhaps slow their own aging process and maybe lower the risk of aging-related diseases. And I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you, this is big business. Even Google, yes, Google has a subsidiary called Calico Life Sciences that is devoted to one thing: finding a cure for the aging process. Yes, they are actually involved in researching anti-aging therapies. So this is not science fiction anymore. There is some serious money being pumped into finding the proverbial fountain of youth. It's interesting that I'm talking about a drug in this episode because in the world of health and fitness, there's mostly, as I've seen over the years, an anti-medication bias on part of people. People often say to me, they'll say, Joe, I don't want to take that drug. I want to take a natural route, a natural way of doing things. I'd rather not take a medication. Interesting, however, when it comes to metformin, this is the one drug that I have heard people over the years saying positive things about. I don't hear people saying positive things about a lot of medications. Metformin is the one drug that even health-conscious people say positive and good things about, especially when it has to do with the aging process. People have literally told me, these are healthy people, that they would think about taking this drug to help slow down the aging process. So in this episode, I want to help address the anti-aging research on metformin and put it into its proper context. While this topic of metformin and aging is technical, and that's an understatement, I want to, in this episode, leave out as many of the $5 words as I possibly can and focus on the clinical research, as well as cover stuff that I think is relevant to whether you're investigating this for yourself or hearing about it for the first time ever. So let's get started and talk about what the heck is metformin. It's a drug, and it's a drug that's usually used to treat diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, sometimes called metabolic syndrome. How does metformin work in this instance? Well, it can help reduce basically the release of sugar into the blood, and it helps improve the sensitivity of our insulin. It improves what's called insulin sensitivity. The more sensitive your insulin is, the better it works at lowering blood sugar, which is important for people with diabetes, right? While metformin is a drug, it's good to know that, like many drugs, this one is actually derived from nature. Metformin is derived from the French lilac plant. The leaves of the plant contain a compound called guanidine, and it's guanidine that metformin is actually derived from. Now, while metformin has been around in America, at least for a couple decades, the plant itself has been used to treat blood sugar levels as far back as the 1650s. So hundreds of years, this French lilac plant has been used. It took until about 1922 before metformin was formally created, and about 30 years later, science is slow to take sometimes. It took about 30 years after that before it was actually used as a drug in France, and the drug was, or still is, called glucophage. So if you see the word glucophage, metformin, they're the same thing. They're both the same medication. And while the French have been using it since the 1950s, it was about the mid-1990s when glucophage, metformin, finally made its way over to America. So how does it help lower blood sugar levels? Well, again, complicated. It works, in the liver, the intestines. Another target area of metformin is the mitochondria. The mitochondria being these powerhouses, these fat-burning batteries that we have inside our cells. And one way the mitochondria are affected by metformin is that metformin appears to inhibit the production of ATP. Energy. ATP is our energy currency. That's what allows us to exercise and move and do everything. Now, if you're hearing about the mitochondria for the very first time, I would say skip back to episode number 8, and that's where I talk a little more about the mitochondria, as well as episode 12, where we discuss little-known exercise benefits. Now, in addition to reducing blood sugar levels, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention to you that metformin has antioxidant properties. It reduces free radicals. That's what antioxidants do. They reduce the production and formation of free radicals. Now, we've been told over the years that antioxidants are good guys and free radicals are bad guys, and we want to have more antioxidants than free radicals. And on the surface, that's actually true. But I bring this up for another reason, because these antioxidants and free radicals, the interaction between them, they also seem to play a role in cell signaling, how cells talk to each other. So it's possible that metformin may have other effects in the body, which we're still exploring, other than its well-known role in helping type 2 diabetics. Sometimes women who have a condition called polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, are prescribed metformin as well. And there's even evidence that it has maybe some anti-cancer effects as well. So metformin has a lot of positive effects. And again, this probably goes a long way to why it's so popular even among those in the health and wellness community. And again, it's been used for decades and has a pretty safe track record. But what about the lifespan enhancing effects of metformin? Can metformin help us live longer, or can it help us stay healthier longer, improve what's called the health span? So can metformin improve the lifespan and maybe even the health span? Well, let's start by looking at the animal research. Turns out there is some evidence for metformin extending the lifespan. It really does actually depend on what we're talking about, however. Studies have documented that metformin can increase the lifespan and health span of worms and mice. Oh, and as an aside, I mentioned health span a couple times ago. Health span is kind of a relatively new term that is popping up in the world of anti-aging medicine. Health span is simply that area of our life where we're healthy. So health span. So lifespan is we're alive, we're not alive. Health span is the part of our lives when we're essentially healthy. Now, it's interesting that I mentioned worms and mice. Some of this research on metformin in mice appears to show that it may be more effective in female mice than male mice. Again, that makes me wonder if maybe there's some kind of a gender-specific interaction going on. It is important to realize that we're humans. We're not mice. We're not worms. And it's also interesting to realize that metformin does not appear to extend the lifespan of rats or fruit flies. And this is a topic I think needs to be thought of more because, again, metformin has this life-enhancing reputation, if you will. And again, the reputation may be species-specific. Worms, mice, okay, maybe. Fruit flies and rats, maybe not. And we don't know why why it seems to work in some animals and not others. Also, and this may be important for us humans, there are some species of rats which live a long time. Metformin does not appear to help them live longer. And that's something very interesting. If the organism lives a long time naturally, metformin may not extend its lifespan. So what does that mean for other long-lived species like us? Well, what is the research on humans and metformin in terms of lifespan? Well, the first thing I want you to realize is that we don't know why humans grow old. We just don't know the answer to that yet. It's actually quite an interesting topic because, it is a question I asked myself when I was 13 years old. It's one that is, I won't say the word haunted, but it's a concept that actually has been with me for many years. I first wondered about this at the age of 13. I didn't know why. And that literally sparked an interest in me that continues to this day. I continue to read the research on anti-aging and what may slow aging, etc. We still don't know why people grow old. That said, the World Health Organization is interesting. They now call aging a disease. This declaration is likely to ramp up research on the causes of the aging process. And I'm sure as we move forward, the research on humans as in terms of anti-aging is likely to increase as well. So what do we know so far in terms of metformin and longevity and humans? Well, compared to non-diabetics, those diabetics who took metformin had lower risks of dying from everything, cancer, heart disease, you name it. So in the diabetics, metformin appeared to increase their health span. Interestingly enough, this effect did not seem to be related to its blood sugar lowering effects. In other words, just because it lowered blood sugar, that's great. We know it does that, but it also appeared to have these other benefits as well. And this is important because it appears to tell us that metformin seems to work in different ways in the body, not just lowering blood sugar levels. Now, what I basically told you came from a study that came out in 2017. This investigation looked at 53 previous metformin studies. The study was literally titled, "Metformin Reduces All-Cause Mortality and Diseases of Aging Independent of its effect on diabetes control, a systematic review and meta-analysis." So basically these researchers, after reviewing the data from 53 previous clinical studies, they made this very interesting statement, and I'm just going to basically quote them here. "The apparent reductions in all-cause mortality and diseases of aging associated with metformin use suggest that metformin could be extending life and health spans by acting as a geroprotective agent." Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. Gero, G-E-R-O, the prefix gero means old age. So they're saying, according to the research that they saw in these 53 previous studies, that it appeared that metformin seems to be acting like an old age protective agent, seemed to help protect us from old age. Wow. I mean, when you read it like that, it's a very bold statement. And this is probably why non-diabetics interested in, say, anti-aging medicine probably want to start taking this stuff. So as impressive as this statement sounds, I kind of want to bring us back down to earth for a minute, and I want to point out that this was a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is a great type of study, but basically what it means is that the researchers did not directly prove metformin lowered the risk of dying from everything. Rather, they just showed that it seemed to be associated with the lower the risk of dying from different diseases. They called all-cause mortality. That's fancy talk for lowering the risk of dying from everything. But again, that's just based on previous studies. To know for sure if metformin is a real deal anti-aging drug, we need to do anti-aging clinical studies. And right now, there aren't any involving humans. Currently, there is no direct human evidence proving that metformin extends the lives of healthy people. That said, there is some interesting writing on the wall, such as another study that's tantalizingly titled this, Metformin in Longevity Study, the Mills Study. Metformin in Longevity Study. I wonder where they get these names from. Basically, these researchers wanted to see if metformin would improve gene function in those with diabetes. And their results appear to show yes. When taking metformin, several of the genes in these individuals seem to alter their function. And while that's really interesting, and while this has a very impressive study name, the Metformin in Longevity Study, they didn't prove that it made people live longer, in spite of the fact that it had longevity in the name. And also, this impressive sounding study only involved 14 people. There was only 14 people. They were over the age of 60. They had diabetes. Essentially, they took metformin for 6 weeks. They took a couple weeks off. Then they basically took a placebo for 6 weeks. And that's basically it. So we got a very small study here that appeared to show that metformin altered the function of certain genes in people with diabetes. That's great. Again, is that going to mean they're going to live longer? Again, this study, in spite of the fact it's got longevity in the name, didn't prove anything in terms of longevity. And I want to point that out because if you've been looking into metformin and reading about anti-aging medicine, you've probably come across the Metformin in Longevity Study. Again, it's usually abbreviated MILS, Mills. Again, it has its limitations. It's an intriguing investigation, but it's definitely got some limitations as far as I'm concerned. There is another study that is being floated around right now, and this is in the pipeline currently. It's the Tame study, T-A-M-E, Tame. Tame is short for Targeting Aging with Metformin. Again, this is an investigation. It's going to be a much larger study involving about 3,000 people. It's going to take about 6 years before we're going to have an answer. And as far as I can tell right now, it's barely off the ground. And so, cool cool name notwithstanding, I'm not going to talk about it because nobody knows what the results are going to be. And again, it's going to take a long time before we know. There's still, as I was going live with this episode, it appeared that they were still trying to raise money for the Tame study. So that's about all we got for right now in terms of human evidence. We've got, one small study showing there seems to be some genetic stuff going on. We've got another study showing that people with diabetes who take metformin seem to have a lower risk of death from different diseases. But whether or not metformin extends the human lifespan, helps us live longer, that is a question that we do not yet know the answer to. Now, that's interesting. It's all great writing on the wall. And there, again, lack of evidence doesn't mean something doesn't work. So, if it does work, if metformin does work, how might it slow the aging process? So I've been, knee deep and eyeball deep in research over the last week or so preparing for this episode. And here are some of the theories on how metformin might work. I want you to realize that these are summaries and it's really in-depth stuff. And there's most likely a lot more to metformin than what I'm talking about here. As we learn more, I'm sure other studies, other theories may pop up. But this is some of what I've seen as I was delving into this topic. Number one, metformin does appear to cause epigenetic changes. Epigenetics is a branch of genetics that deals with how the environment can alter gene expression. And we've already seen, again, from the Mills study, that metformin does appear to alter the expression of certain genes. And again, that's great. And these epigenetic changes appear to also go to the cellular environment as well. We know, for instance, that metformin seems to alter the cellular environment by, for instance, interacting with sirtuins. Sirtuins are protein-based enzymes that appear to be involved in the aging process. And what do sirtuins need to work? They need NAD levels. NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And NAD has been shown to be elevated with metformin use. People taking metformin have higher levels of NAD levels. And again, that's what sirtuins need to function properly. So that's quite interesting, especially these days, because raising NAD levels as a way to help the aging process is very popular these days. If you've not ever heard of NAD before, skip back to episode number 8, where I talk in depth about NAD and a dietary supplement that is touted to raise NAD levels. Aside from the epigenetic changes, it's also been shown that the microbiome is altered when people take metformin. The microbiome we often think it refers to the bacteria in our large intestines. I like to point out the microbiome is on our skin. It's all over the place. But when you take metformin, it does appear to alter the bacteria content inside of us, and that's really good because by improving the content of the bacteria inside of us, this means those good bacteria which are being formed, they seem to make more compounds, which we in turn can use to stay healthy. For instance, these bacteria will then make more of what are called short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are compounds that are made by bacteria, which we in turn can use to perhaps lower the risk of colon cancer, heart disease, inflammation, etc. So we've got some microbiome changes that appear to be going on with metformin use. As an aside, this whole microbiome metformin topic is a wide open area that I personally think needs more research on it. If you want to know more about the microbiome, skip back to episode number 16. That's where I talk a lot about the microbiome and how we can alter it for the better. So we've got epigenetic changes, we've got some microbiome changes, and the next topic in terms of how metformin might work is going to get complicated. So sit back, because I want to spend a couple minutes talking about this, and here it is. Metformin inhibits an enzyme called MTOR. The letter M, MTOR, MTOR. Now, if you've never heard of MTOR before, I didn't mean to rhyme like that. MTOR stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. Mammalian target of rapamycin. Some other researchers will call it another name. They'll call it the mechanistic target of rapamycin. So either way, MTOR stands for either mammalian target of rapamycin or mechanistic target of rapamycin. Okay, what the heck is that? Well, mTOR is an enzyme. It's an enzyme that's involved in protein synthesis and cell growth. So it helps cells grow. It's involved in protein synthesis. Basically, mTOR makes things grow, and overproduction, overactivity, if you will, of the mTOR enzyme is associated with a variety of diseases such as cancer and diabetes and other conditions where you don't want to have an awful lot of cell growth. In theory, inhibiting mTOR could slow down cell division and may prolong lifespan. And there is actually some evidence of this too. For instance, back in 2009, researchers gave an mTOR inhibiting drug called rapamycin to mice, and it led to an increase in lifespan by about 40%. This rapamycin drug appeared to increase the lifespan by these mice by about 40%. So trivia, rapamycin, you may be saying, what the heck is rapamycin? It's an anti-tissue rejection drug. It actually suppresses the immune system. And it was actually discovered by bacteria living on Easter Island. Another name for Easter Island is Rapa Nui. So that's where it got its name from. Get it? Rapa Nui, rapamycin. So if you've never seen Easter Island before, you probably have. It's that island in the Pacific that has all those giant statues on the beach. If you've ever seen an episode of Ancient Aliens, they like to show Easter Island a lot. But basically, that's where they discovered the rapamycin compound. Again, rapamycin has its own anti-aging reputation, which I'll probably address at some future episode. But again, I wanted to bring that up because it was quite interesting, and I thought people who were interested in anti-aging medicine had probably heard of mTOR as well as rapamycin. So how does all this work? Well, again, let's just bring this home because again, this gets kind of complicated. But essentially, metformin causes a rise in AMP levels. AMP is adenosine monophosphate. It causes a rise in AMP. This, in turn, activates an enzyme called AMPK. AMPK. AMPK stands for AMP, activated protein kinase. It's another enzyme. Great. What does AMPK do? Inhibits TOR. So, again, now you see how things kind of came full circle. We know that metformin inhibits that mTOR compound, that enzyme mTOR, and it does so because metformin causes a rise in AMPK. AMPK, in turn, reduces TOR. So, just as rapamycin inhibits mTOR and appears to lengthen the lifespan of mice, the thought might be that metformin might extend the life in the same way because it also inhibits mTOR. That's the theory, or hope anyway. So is it more complicated than this? You betcha. And that's an understatement. I wanted to mention this stuff because those who are interested in anti-aging medicine have undoubtedly heard about mTOR and AMPK. And I honestly thought it was worth putting them in their proper perspective because, again, these are pretty weighty topics in the world of the anti-aging medicine world. Food for thought. You don't want to take rapamycin, and I don't blame you. A few other things that might inhibit mTOR are, for instance, low levels of oxygen. Again, kind of hard to do unless you live in, say, Colorado. Low levels of oxygen seem to inhibit mTOR. What ultimately does that lead to enhanced lifespan? That I couldn't answer. I didn't see any definitive research on oxygen levels, mTOR, and longevity. Again, if you look at, say, people in Colorado is one of the healthiest states in America. Why do they tend to have less disease? Could it be because they exercise more? Could it be because they have a better diet? Or because maybe they have lower levels of mTOR? It's hard to say. Speaking of diet, there is some preliminary evidence that a ketogenic diet may also reduce mTOR, at least in rats. Humans, let's see. Now, another thing that appears to reduce that mTOR enzyme is eating a lower animal protein diet. So less steak, for instance, lower mTOR. The more animal protein we tend to consume, the higher that mTOR seems to be ramped up. Now, if I drill down a little further, there is also some evidence that cutting back on the amino acid leucine may also reduce the activity of mTOR. Leucine is one of the branch chain amino acids. Leucine, isoleucine, and valine. They usually go together hand in hand, and leucine usually gets a lot of the attention because of its ability to increase mTOR. And as an aside, I bring this up because leucine is kind of popular in the world of bodybuilding and exercise and strength training. The idea here is that by taking leucine amino acids, it stimulates mTOR, and this in turn will cause muscles to get bigger when they're combined with resistance training, strength training. So depending on which camp you're in, mTOR, leucine can either be a good thing or not a good thing. And there's also some evidence that the amino acid arginine may increase mTOR as well. So eating less arginine may also reduce mTOR as well. I bring up arginine because, again, it's a non-essential amino acid. Non-essential means we make arginine in our bodies naturally. And also, if you take any dietary supplements, arginine is often found in pre-workout supplements as well as nitric oxide boosting supplements. Why? Arginine, the amino acid, helps us make a compound called nitric oxide. So if you got freaked out when I mentioned arginine, you're taking these things and you're thinking, oh, I want to watch my arginine intake. Well, nitric oxide supplements, pre-workout supplements, they theoretically would increase mTOR activity. But the long-term implications of that, it's hard to say. If you have ever read the book, The China Study, they go in depth on leucine and mTOR and its relationship to cancer. So I'd say I'll put a link to that in the description if you can check it out yourself if you haven't heard of it. Now, at the end of the day, I honestly can't say what impact any of these will have on longevity, life extension, or health span. Most of the research on all this stuff is not on humans. It's on mice and rats and worms and stuff like that. Also, I personally think it's wise to not put all our anti-aging eggs in the mTOR basket. Don't believe the hype. The aging process is more complicated than just mTOR. And I think this is really wise to keep in the back of our minds because we often like to boil things down to just one thing, one common denominator. Sometimes this works, but in biology, it's my experience that things are often more complicated than this. So while mTOR may play a role in the aging process, I think there's more going on than just this. So what about side effects from, say, metformin if you want to take this as a drug for yourself? Well, if you're not a diabetic, again, there are people out there who want to take this who are not diabetics. One problem I think you may run into is you got to get this from a doctor. And again, because it is a prescription medication. As an aside, I had a physical this week and I actually asked my doctor, have any non-diabetics ever asked you for metformin? And he said yes. Some people have asked him. He hasn't done it, but some people have been asking him. And again, it goes back to the reputation metformin has as a health-promoting life extension medication. So that said, again, you're going to have some problems getting this from a physician, I think. But beyond that, if you're going to start taking this, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, are you allergic to metformin? It's rare, but it is possible. So that's definitely something I think you need to be talking to your physician about. Also, in addition to that, remember that metformin can cause a vitamin B12 deficiency. B12 is interesting because it's a B vitamin, and we've all heard that we urinate out B vitamins and we don't store them. Well, B12 is actually the exception to that rule. We store B12 in our livers. We've got about a couple years worth of B12 inside of us. And eventually, if we didn't replenish it on a semi-regular basis, we'd run out of it. Well, metformin can deplete B12 levels. So I think most healthy people probably are not deficient in B12, but I think this theoretically could be a problem, say, in older folks, vegans, again, in diabetics as well who don't eat very well. They could also eventually wind up with a B12 deficiency. Again, while rare, it's a possibility, and definitely if you're doing this, it's a good idea to be getting your B12 levels checked at least semi-regularly. And then another thing to think about if you're considering metformin is there is a possibility that it could cause a rise in lactic acid levels. This is technically called lactic acidosis. So an overproduction of lactic acid or an inability to get rid of it quick enough could alter the pH of the body, and the body doesn't want to be too acid. It doesn't want to be too alkaline either. Either way, an upset in the pH of the body could be actually kind of serious. Which again is another reason why you want to not, just try to grab this stuff off the internet and talk to a doctor. Again, the lactic acid overdose thing is probably fairly rare. I think it's probably more likely in people with kidney problems and liver problems. But still, it's a serious condition, and it's why, again, I want to be overly conservative when it's talking about medications, and try to get to your doctor first so you can get the best advice for you. So again, metformin, pretty good reputation for anti-aging in spite of the fact that the human evidence really isn't there yet. I personally think we've got a lot of questions that we need to know the answers to. So here is a short list of questions that I think we need to know about in terms of metformin and longevity. I'm going to list these for you because, again, if you're thinking about this for yourselves, these are some questions that you should be asking yourself. For one thing, do the life extension studies in worms and mice, for instance, translate into people? Does metformin help human beings live longer? We don't know the answer to that yet. We may not know the answer to that yet for several years. And that, for me, that's the biggest thing. Number two, if metformin works, if it's an anti-aging medication, does it work for everybody? That's an interesting question to ask because not all type 2 diabetics respond to metformin. So if it really has longevity properties, might they also be limited to only some people? Again, we'll need more studies to figure this out. Another thing to think about is, we as I discussed earlier in this episode, there is some evidence that diabetics who take metformin seem to have a lower risk of a variety of different diseases. Well, that's in type 2 diabetics. What about healthy people? Does metformin reduce the risk of diseases, those same diseases, in healthy people, like it seems to do in type 2 diabetics? We don't know the answer to that yet. Number four, and this is a biggie, if metformin is a longevity life extension drug, what is the correct dosage to take? Is the life extension health span dosage the same, for instance, as the dosage that, say, a doctor would give to a type 2 diabetic? Or would, say, lower dosages taken over many years have the same beneficial effects? We don't know the answer to that either. Another thing that we might want to be thinking about is, does metformin work equally as well in men and women? Remember, there is some highly preliminary evidence that it may work better in female mice. Do women have a greater life extension benefit from metformin if it really does work than, say, men? We don't know the answer to that yet. Something else to think about is that if metformin works, does it work as well as exercise? Exercise is known to reduce the risk of a variety of different diseases, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, strokes, etc. And there's even some evidence that regular exercise extends the human lifespan as well. Exercise versus metformin. That would be an interesting trial to do. And as an aside, I would point out that there is some research noting that metformin may negate some of the beneficial effects of exercise. For instance, it may reduce muscle growth, muscle hypertrophy. So again, I'd like to see a couple more studies on this, but those research studies are floating around. So it is something to consider. But I have yet to see a exercise versus metformin study, but I have seen investigations where regular exercisers live longer than non-exercisers. And then something else that occurred to me as I was preparing for this episode, what about supplements? Do supplements work similar to, say, metformin in terms of mTOR, et cetera? And I bring this up for a reason, because remember that metformin, the drug, is derived from the French lilac plant. Turns out that there are dietary supplements that contain this herbal ingredient, and you can identify them by noting the Latin name for French lilac plant. And I'll give it to you here, but I'm probably going to butcher it because, I'm horrible at these Latin names. But here it is: Galegia officinalis. There, I ruined it, and I apologize, but I'm good at English, and I'm not even that good at English sometimes, but I'm even worse at these Latin names. Galegia officinalis. Forget it. I got nothing. But that is I'll link to that word in the show notes so you can look it up yourself. But there are supplements out there containing this herbal ingredient. It also goes by the name goat's rue, goat as in G-O-A-T, goat, and rue, R-U-E. So that's another name for the French lilac plant. Is it possible that these dietary supplements may have similar life extension properties as metformin? I doubt it, but I can't say either way because I've not seen any life extension research on, say, even animals in terms of these dietary supplements. But for those thinking about taking the herbal supplement, I would say skip back to episode number 2 because that's where I gave you some tips on how I pick dietary supplements. But again, just something that occurred to me. They're out there. Interestingly enough, the dietary supplements are not usually touted for lowering blood sugar or even life extension. They're touted for other things, which again makes me wonder why they haven't promoted them or why that ingredient is not even being found in so-called anti-aging supplements. But that may change as metformin gets more traction and more publicity. And that's really what I got for you in terms of metformin and the anti-aging research so far. I have a few thoughts on this that I kind of want to sum up this episode with, and basically it's this. There's no doubt that what was once thought to be science fiction is quickly gaining acceptance among some in the medical world. And for me, it's a welcome change, having been interested in this whole anti-aging thing for over 40 years, since I was 13 years of age. And while I have no doubt that the 21st century is going to probably be a watershed moment that's going to bring medical revolutions into this greatest of mysteries, I also know that we've got a lot to learn. Well, I can't say for sure if metformin will turn out to be the first big anti-aging longevity medication. I know it won't be the last. The trick is to hang in there long enough to see what the future holds in store for us. So what do you think? Hopefully I've been able to help you understand this whole longevity science of metformin a little better. But if you have any questions, leave them below in the comments and I'll do my best to answer myself. As always, if you need to reach me yourself, you can do so at either of my websites, joe-cannon.com or supplementclarity.com. And I wasn't kidding when I said I cover a lot of anti-aging supplements at supplementclarity.com. And if you ever encountered one that you wanted me to look up, send me an email and I'll be very happy to take a look at it for you and maybe even write a review on it. So with that, I will leave you with the quote of the week. And this quote comes from Roy Walford, who, if you've never heard his name before, he is one of the seminal researchers in the anti-aging world. And his quote comes like this: "The study shows that you can produce positive health changes in people through calorie restriction, but the data I've seen don't show anything about aging." Some interesting words to think about as you delve into the metformin topic further. Until next time, everybody, I'm Joe Cannon. When you go out, don't forget, try to make a difference.